What's up, everybody? Okay, so in order to start knocking some of these design requests out, we're just going to start in order that they came in, coloring in different layers and making it look nice. This is a pain point for a lot of us, probably so. We'll start in Morpholio and then we'll try to get into concepts, but for this first one, we're just going to stick with Morpholio and how I structure my layering system, the tiers I follow, and then just some good practice for keeping everything organized. So let's go. All right, so for this tutorial, we're going to be using just your iPad with your stylus, if you have one, and then also the regular standard Morpholio Trace app. Pro version is not required. We're not going to be importing or exporting PDFs for this tutorial. All right, so what you're going to do is you're going to select the plus sign in the top right corner of the Morpholio Trace screen. And what we're going to go with is the custom option, just because we're going to be able to control our paper size. And not necessarily that it matters for this tutorial, but I normally always start with a custom project, just so you're kind of familiar with my workflow. And you do have a variety of options here, but what we're going to go with is actually the blank. And I'm going to select the tabloid 11 by 17, but as you can see, there's a variety of options that you can choose from. But for this tutorial, I'm just going to go with kind of the standard half size, quote unquote. And we're actually going to set the scale to true 1:1. Okay, and by default, once you get into a new project, Morpholio gives you the base layer, which is on the bottom. And then on top of that, you have just your standard blank layer. If you double click on this, it gives you the extent of the layer, and right now it's a perfect fit over our 11 by 17 base layer. And what I'm going to do is actually duplicate this first layer a few times. If you've taken any of my private sketching lessons, we go into far greater detail about the importance of this, but just for the sake of this tutorial, is I want you to copy this first blank layer 2 additional times, so you have a total of 3 blank layers that are above the 4th base layer. And what I've found to help with, conveying the reasoning behind this is think of it as like you're building a 3-layered cake in this sense. First, we're going to have on the bottom our actual base color, then our accent or highlight layer, and then finally on top we'll have our line work. But we're not necessarily going to work in this order from the start. Because of the way Morpholio actually works, we're going to have to work a little backwards. We'll actually start with line weight or line work, then we'll apply our base color above that, and then we'll move some layers around, and then we add our color accents in last. All right, so let's get started. So the first thing you want to do is toggle off top 2 layers, so we're only drawing on the layer right above the base layer. And if you don't know how layers work, just a quick graphic representation of what's happening. The topmost layer that's on is the layer that your line work or whatever type of illustration you're doing or putting down on the iPad, that's where that's going to go. So if I toggle off the first and then illustrate something else on the second layer, you'll see that if I turn the first layer, top layer back on and off, and then go do something like try to erase it, only the top layer is going to erase. Some of you may already know this, but there may be a lot of people that don't really understand the working components of a layer. And the same thing, you turn the top off, leave the second one on, the square shape gets erased, and vice versa. All right, so I'm going to go through and just clear the line work that was drawn on these top 2 layers while turning them off as I make my way down the layer panel. All right, so now we should be ready to go. We have our first initial layer on, and I'm going to go ahead and select the ruler guide so I can get some shapes going that we can fill and start to get our textures laid down. All right, so start by just drawing a 4-inch line vertical. You're going to draw another 4-inch line horizontally, and then you're going to do the same thing going back vertical and back horizontal, so you'll have a 4-inch by 4-inch square. All right, now that the square is drawn, I'm going to go up and select my lasso tool in the top left corner. It looks like the little mouse pointer, and select your shape and drag it over to the left side of your page, duplicate it once, then select both, duplicate them down. That way you have 4 squares showing up on your 11 by 17 page. Now with both squares shown, I'm going to go ahead and lasso out all 4, grab one of the bottom right corners of the lasso extent, and I'm just going to expand them to grow a little larger on the page. That way you can kind of see more detail of what you're actually about to do when we render these squares out. All right, so I'm actually going to go ahead and re-illustrate this cake diagram just so we can kind of reference it as we're going through this process. Right now, we just actually completed the first phase of the line work, which in the end is going to end up on top of our stacking of the layer system. But for right now, it needs to stay on the bottom because when we go to color fill these shapes for our base color, the Morpholio app is only going to register the hatch extent to the line work underneath the blank layer that you're trying to fill. All right, so with our top layer on above our line work, we're going to select a green for our sod base. And when I illustrate plans, I normally like to use 3 different tints of a color, just because that gives you a good medium, dark, and light option. Next, we're going to go with a gravel color. In this case, I like a lighter brown because of the white that we're going to add for the contrast in the next step. And then bottom right is going to be our flat work. I'm going to go with just like a limestone color. So it's going to be kind of this creamish yellow. Again, the middle tint, and then the bottom left will be our water or swimming pool graphic. So now that we got our base layer down, we're going to go ahead and add another just layer of complexity to this base layer. And if you go to your hatch fill options, there's architectural, landscape, and interior. But for the sod, what we're going to use is the landscape. And it's the 4th one down on the far left, this kind of dot pattern. So with this pattern selected, if you zoom in, go ahead and select a darker green. And once you have that darker green selected, you can select the little scale option here, and this ramps up the size of the hatch pattern itself. And what we're going to do is actually put a couple of layers of this. The cool thing about this app is it actually recognizes this color fill shape now, and you can keep stacking hatches on top of one another, which is a pretty awesome thing, especially for adding some visual complexity to your drawing. And so you just shake the crosshair, and then you can adjust the scale down, and it gives you this nice little visual complexity when you refill this color hatch. And next we're going to repeat the same process for the gravel. You're just going to go over 2 hatches to the right and select the gravel option. I'm going to go with a high contrast color like white and adjust the scale and then fill it, and boom, there's your gravel detail. All right, so these are actually the only 2 accents that we're going to add on our base layer. The next accents are going to actually go on the accent layer itself. And so you can go ahead and revert your hatch back to solid fill if you want to. That's something I usually normally do for good practice. But now we're going to move on to the accent layer of our cake. Next, you'll want to toggle on the layer that's above our base layer. So this is our 3rd and final layer. And again, this is our accent layer. So with our accent layer toggled on, I'm going to go to the color fill option and navigate down to the 7th row far right and grab this running bond brick paver pattern. I say it's a brick paver pattern. It could be a large format stone, whatever it might be. But what you do is then since we have the extent of the fill shown, you can put your crosshair within the extent and then adjust the scale up. And I'm going to pick probably this dark brown to illustrate the grout joints. And the reason being, you want a nice contrast, but you don't want something that's too overpowering that makes it look unrealistic. Next, I'm going to hop over to our water graphic and select the brush nib marker. I like this just because of the bleed control, but the rich color that it offers. And I'm going to pick some type of pen tip size, like around the 6. Grab the darker of the blue that I have. And then I'm going to go ahead and just trace the extent or the exterior portion of the water graphic just to give it this nice little shadowing edge look. All right, and then I'll chase the darker outline with a lighter blue just to give it some nice visual hierarchy. All right, and then the next thing I want to do with the water is add a little bit of visual movement. I'm going to grab the chalk, ramp the smoothness up, and this is going to allow me to have better curve control over my stylus. And you can see you can adjust it, and it just makes everything a little more fluid whenever you go to illustrate some graphics on top of your plans. So with your chalk brush selected, you can start just drawing in some wisps like this. This is going to give you just that nice little water movement visual, and we'll continue to layer certain, graphics on top of this, but just getting the base down is going to be a crucial component to this. All right, so next I'm going to grab my technical pen. With my ruler selected, I'm going to go ahead and just draw in a few little diamond shapes, and this is going to give just that kind of sparkling of the water. And then with your technical pen still selected, you can go with, doing some dots. Again, this just adds a little bit of visual movement. Adjusting the size of the dots too is also just good practice. It adds a layer of the visual complexity that we're looking for. And then of course, following up with a darker, higher contrasting color like a black that just really jumps off of the blue visual that it's overlaid on. And then of course, if you want to get cute with it, you can grab the protractor tool and, reduce it down to like an ellipse and, start small and then work your way out with just subtle increases of the protractor's circumference or diameter. And this is going to give you a nice little ripple effect that'll just add to, the believability of the surface being some type of moving water. All right, so back to our flat work, and honestly, I have no idea why I jumped around. We could have just, stuck with this one and then moved on to the water, but in any sense, get a darker color now, like a high contrasting black, and then you can just, lightly go over the grout joints. I'm actually using the brush nib marker, but very, very lightly, tracing over these. The brush nib is actually pressure sensitive on the iPad screen, so the harder you press, the thicker the line weight will be. But if you're trying to get some really, nice, sharp, undulating graphics, the brush nib marker is good. And grout joints are, they're not necessarily perfect in real life. So having some variation in there, not adds a nice complexity to it. And it just, allows it to read a little nicer too when you're illustrating your plans. All right, so now what I want you to do is actually double click on the base layer over on your layer panel, and it'll highlight in yellow. And what this does, it allows you to draw on the layer underneath the topmost layer. And we're actually going to shade a little bit on our base layer now that we have the accent layer filled with our grout lines. And again, this is just going to add a little extra level of depth, but you can see if you double click on it, you can actually illustrate underneath the topmost layer. Double click off of it, you're now going to draw back on your top. Now you can do this another way by pulling it up above the layer, but then you lose your grout line work. So double click your base layer and then grab your brush nib marker, and we're just going to go ahead and grab a darker brown and start getting some of these darker shadows that can fall within the grout line of your flat work. So the next thing I'm going to do is select the lightest of the three yellowish cream color tints and go in and start adding a little bit of highlights to your flat work. This is going to really start to make your illustrations pop, jump off the page, and just, add another level of depth to the illustration. All right, once you finish adding the lights to your flat work, we're gonna jump up to the aggregate or the gravel layer. And this is actually gonna be pretty simple. We're just gonna go with one of the darker browns. And I like to go and just kind of shade the edge of the extent of my hatch. And, nothing too crazy, nothing too fancy, but it just adds a nice little detail and helps everything in regards to the gravel hatches read just a little easier. And then finally, we're going to jump to our sod or turf grass illustration. And for this, I normally go with the grease pencil. It's going to give a little more of a refined effect rather than the chalk. Grouping's a little tighter on it, and I think it's personally just a little cleaner of a look, but still gives you that kind of sketchy feel. And first thing I'll do is trace the perimeter of the extent. All right, so once you trace the extent, grab the darkest of the three green tints that you use and start just pulling some lines with your grease pencil. Then go back with your lighter of the greens, and this is going to add your highlights, adds for a nice little bit of visual complexity, and then topping it off with some of this lighter of the cream color. Again, the contrast that this offers from a visual standpoint is really nice, and it looks great once you pull everything together. So pro tip, grab your lasso tool, and then since everything's separated, you can grab it, duplicate your line work, and then start copying it over. That way you're not just sitting there pulling lines. And then you're going to do the same thing for the bottom portion as well, and this should wrap up your graphics for the grass detail. All right, so we've completed all three layers of our cake. Now it's time to get them in order. Right now, our line work is actually on our base layer because we were controlling our hatch extents with that. And so what we're gonna do now is just tap and hold your line work and pull it to the top. And now everything should be in order from line work at the top, your accents in the middle, and then your base color layers at the bottom. And before we wrap up, I'm going to take this one step further. I actually created 3 new blank layers, and just keep in mind that all throughout when you're drawing, follow this same guideline for your shrubs, trees, and everything should work out really well for you. So I'm going to show you how I illustrate a person in plan graphic. In this case, there's a person on an inner tube, and what we're going to do is lay down our line work first. Again, think of the cake, we're starting over, so line work first. Then we're going to flip on our color base layer, but what I'm going to do is actually bring my line work up to the top and then double tap on my base layer and lay down my color. This way I can just see where I'm actually filling to the extent within the line drawing itself. In this case, it's the person on the inner tube. And what I'm actually doing now is I turned on the third accent layer, quote unquote, but after thinking about this, we're gonna act as the white is the accent layer, and now our base is gonna be the this shadow. So if you grab your roller brush, dial it down to like a 40 or 50%, then you can trace the outline of the figure that you're drawing. And once you have that complete, you can grab the lasso tool, and then with your layer selected, just shift it whichever direction that you want the sun to be oriented. All right, so that concludes this workshop. I hope you learned something. If you have any feedback, feel free to leave me a comment below. Also, if you're on Instagram, feel free to upload your work and tag me in it. I'd love to see what you've come up with. I'll also repost it on my page. You can also get the digital files for this workshop in my Gumroad link below. And yeah, hopefully we'll keep in touch, and feel free to shoot me an email or DM if you have any questions.